Welcome back, everyone, to the Playful Horizons featured speaker series. We are overjoyed today to have my friend and colleague Kit Chalkley here, who's going to be talking about all things media, trans interactive media, art, social media, affect, and yeah, whatever other topics we stray into from our questions and yours. Before we dive in, I do want to say the next speaker we will be hosting is Alex Rudenschold from the University of California, Irvine. That'll be next Tuesday, April 1st, also at 10 a.m. and we will be talking specifically about the wide world of furry studies and anthropomorphism and how that intersects with queer studies and media studies. By popular request, we made it happen. But today we have some very exciting things on the docket. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about our speaker. Kit Chalkley is a PhD student in communication studies at McGill University in Jojage, or Muniyang, known as the city of Montreal, studying the epistemological histories of machine learning. Kit completed his master's degree in communication studies at Carleton University, where he wrote his MA thesis on digital media and trans world building. They also completed their undergraduate degree in communication and media studies at Carleton, which culminated in an award-winning honors research paper exploring the intertwined social and ecological histories of reproductive hormones, which is super interesting. He also works with the Transgender Media Lab at Carleton University and has helped design and build the Transgender Media Portal, an online tool which aims to help circulate the diversity of trans-made audiovisual media to the public. Now, in the his third year as a member of his department's Graduate Student Association executive team, Kit runs workshops and offers peer support to help others access and finance post-secondary education. Kit is a 2024 Pierre Elliott Trudeau Scholar, a 2022 Tomlinson Doctoral Fellow, a 2020 Governor General's Academic Medal Awardee, and currently holds a doctoral scholarship from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. Holy shit. He has published in the Journal of LGBTQ Youth, TOPIA, Canadian Journal of Cultural Studies, and Canadian Journal of Communication. A very impressive rap sheet, and we are thrilled to have you here. Thanks so much for joining us, Kit. And yeah, let's start it off with the question that we ask every speaker that we bring in, which is, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? What's your academic background, and what got you into studying media and doing trans media studies research?
I ended up applying to Carleton, got into their comms program. I was like, this sounds like kind of relevant to what I do design-wise, and like totally fell in love with it. And I think a big part of that is like, yeah, having had the privilege to kind of get my kind of life together a little bit more before really going into this undergrad. So I was a mature student. I was in my mid to late 20s doing my undergrad, and found just like, found critical theory, found lots of cool interdisciplinary kind of objects and like frameworks to think things through, and was just like, how do I get to keep doing this? So that's how I got here and how I am what I'm still doing with my PhD now. And it has, as also kind of the bio mentioned, has gone in many directions. I was really interested in transness and environmental hormones, and wrote a bit about that, and have talked more about digital media use and often kind of like trans digital art making. And now I'm also kind of pivoting back into kind of historical stuff, and kind of historical media and histories of like trans activism, and seeing how these things kind of intertwine in kind of odd ways sometimes. So that's kind of, where I came from and how I got here. But I do also have to say, because this is where I'm talking, I'm not a gamer, and I am not actually formally in game studies.
Yes. No, I know. Which I think this, if anything, is sort of illustrative of your profile, just in that like you still made the cut. Like that's high praise. You're our one like token non-game person that we bring onto the series. We've done this once every season, but I think for context, I'm currently teaching a course on trans and queer game design, where we've talked a lot about how play becomes an important tool for thinking about art making, and community building and creativity, and also just like survival in the midst of, ongoing bullfuckery at seemingly every angle. So first of all, you're totally welcome. We are taking a very kind of wide understanding of play, and the students who are here have read your bio already, so nobody is going to be like, excuse me, where's your gamer card? I'm gonna need to see some gamer score on Xbox Live. But
So true.
I do really appreciate your framing here, because I know for a number of students, that question of how do I keep doing this? I've discovered this thing that I really enjoy or that matters to me, and that question of how I can keep doing the thing that I found that's valuable, is, I think, for a lot of people, kind of the guiding star as you figure out, okay, I've been an undergrad, now what am I doing? So that's good to hear that that was also sort of the case for you. Now, I was wondering, because I know you've been doing some work on how trans and queer folks make use of different technologies, including social media, but also facial recognition and gender detection algorithms. Would you be open to sharing a bit about what you're working on at the moment and how this project came about?
Yeah. So I've been really interested in kind of this concept of trans technologies, which comes out of a co-authored paper led by Oliver Hameson, and he actually also just published a book with the same title, which is excellent. Everyone should go read it. So I've been very interested in like trans technologies and whatever, like what that might be, and how to kind of think about them. And for me, trans tech, I kind of look at it on kind of two scales, both the kind of infrastructural level. So often that looks like platforms for me, because a lot of where I'm finding these kind of technologies is on social media platforms. And then also the specific technologies and techniques that are being used on platforms. And I'm looking at how those things kind of like come together in order to like have these kind of opportunities to play really with the construction of gender, and kind of inform how you become who you are in a way. So I guess the construction of subjectivity. And a lot of that really comes from kind of like being in specifically communication and media studies, and thinking about trans studies in relation to that, and having some like frustration with like trans media being seen as like a solely about representation, where it's about what kind of first off, is there representation, and then what kind of narratives are being spoken of, and then trying to kind of adjudicate those narratives. And there's a lot of good work happening in there, and in those like kind of spaces, and a lot of them are kind of pointing out that trying to adjudicate what a good narrative is, or like good representation, can be like really limiting, and that we need diversity of narratives and other ways of thinking about what trans subjectivity is. That is, we can do the representational aspect, and then for me, I'm thinking more of like, how do you get beyond representation and think about interacting with media as a way of having the construction of subjectivity happening in that kind of relationship.
Yeah, that's really fantastic, and I think that's something I know in trans and queer game design we've talked about quite a bit. I mean, we opened with a couple of weeks talking very specifically about representation, and in the game space, a lot of the very first video game characters that one could archive as being these are the first trans characters in video games. Like, there's a lot of really complex and problematic contexts there, and very often the debates that ensue about what does and doesn't count end up being really gross, and really problematic, and kind of eschewing everything that could actually be interesting about these histories. And yeah, I'm curious. I mean, so for you, like, it sounds like looking at these these actual practices and the things that trans folks are
Yeah.
doing with technology and media. Is that sort of your answer then for how we can move beyond at least that very kind of limited interpretation of representation?
Yeah. I'm really glad you like put the word practices there actually, because
Yeah.
that is like how it is. And practices, and like this kind of gets to my kind of discussion of like techniques as well as infrastructures as forms of trans technology, because practices are shaped by the infrastructures and the context around them always, right? Which then lets you have, yeah, many narratives and many ways of these practices playing out. So, for example, I mean, actually, you've heard of it, but this one, but like one of the kind of case studies I've like talked about a bit is the use of like a Twitter bot, for example.
Yeah.
And so Twitter bots, well, I mean, it's this within the context, right, of Twitter. So we talk about infrastructure, you get this platform formerly known as Twitter. I'm gonna dead name it, very bad trend of me, but um, so you're on Twitter, which is like this like increasingly hostile kind of space for gender diversity. Twitter actually, like right since the get-go, has always assigned its users a gender, even though they didn't know, for advertising purposes. So based on your interactions online, based on like what kind of people you follow and how you tweet, it would actually be like you're male or female. And so there's like this really like like wildly like just like that makes sense for, I guess, from an advertising perspective, when you think about like people being agents of themselves and having their own form of identity that is far more complex than that is not tied to capitalist productivity, just completely falls flat in its face. And so I was really fascinated with this Twitter bot called GenderBot, which would tweet out a new gender every like 6 hours, like a gender of the day. And I was really interested in it because it was a way of using algorithmic techniques and practices to then create this kind of like a little space on this platform that actually was like really challenging what the infrastructural aspects of the platform were saying what gender had to be or what it could look like. So there were, like these tweets were like, today's gender is like, fuzzy sweaters that smell like fresh laundry detergent or something. And but there was just such a huge amount of them, and they were all very sensory, often had a lot of smells and sounds attached to them. But they gained a lot of traction with people just being like, oh, like I can feel that. There's like an effective response to that actually. And my feeling of gender really like in this moment like sits with that kind of description. And it was an interesting way that like people started to like follow it and kind of defend this Twitter bot's kind of like practices when trolls would jump on. And there was this interesting kind of I guess like an algorithmic resistance that was happening within this space. But of course, I mean, Twitter is no longer Twitter, and Twitter bots, which rely on the Twitter API, no longer can really function. So it also shows how the role of like policy and political economies of platforms are ultimately kind of become these gatekeepers that really stop these opportunities for playing with gender and the rules of that online. So.
No, I think that's really kind of inspiring, and I think is very indicative of something I know we've talked about before, which is like the play behind it, right? And creating space for play, even in at the site of something that is very constrictive. The fact that so many social media platforms just interpret so much about us based on our internet practices. It's so funny then to see how those algorithms end up creating kind of these emergent sites of resistance. I have put an example in the chat for folks, but for those watching the recording, unfortunately, GenderBot no longer exists on Twitter. But I think I don't know if this was the original or one of the clones, but this is very much following the format where it would tweet every day. And this example is today's gender is the sound of a dial tone, but often kind of these abstract forms. And I will say, although unfortunately Twitter bots no longer work with the current API, and you can no longer use what was called cheap bots done quick, there is a blue sky. Oh, there is one. Oh, beautiful. Well, thank you for this, Kit.
For now.
So at Gender of the Day on Twitter, we can at least see the
X,
archive.
yeah.
That's very
It's
good.
there for now.
It's there for now.
Yeah,
Hooray.
it's there for now.
I'm trying to see what was the last one tweeted. Ah, today's gender is a rake of eels. Beautiful.
Mhm.
For those of you, though, who might be interested in developing a bot of your own, I will say there is a tool for Blue Sky out now. You can go to Blue Bots Done Quick, and using something as simple as tracery, which we covered last semester in MST 350, or will cover if you've yet to take 350 with me. Anyway, you can make your own Blue Sky bot. Is it Skeets? Is that what they're calling it? I don't remember. What's the Blue Sky equivalent of tweets?
I truly, yeah, I don't know.
I'm not sure. I think it's Skeets, but maybe that's horrible. In any case, so on that note though, Kit, so many of our speakers in this series, as you alluded to at the front end, tend to focus on play and game design. And although most of your work focuses on social media and kind of other artistic media forms, I know play and technology are both really big components of your work. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts about what it means to play in the context of other technologies, like social media or facial recognition or one of the other techs you're looking at.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. I mean, okay, so this is also how I have kind of become, attached to game studies, is that there is so much good work done by cool queer and trans scholars who are, thank you very much, who are
Doing our
talking about
best.
play in this way.
Yeah.
Doing amazing, and in a way that I think, I think a lot of disciplines that don't like kind of pay attention to game studies is really missing out on, because it's like such rich theoretical tools to work with, and so that's largely like how I've been thinking about play, because it lets me think about particular like norms as a form of rules, and how those things get enacted into technologies, like literally built into them. So also talking about, like, for example, automated gender recognition, like you can think about how, like, really right from the ground up, how these tools are trained is that there is, binary gender, and that is something that is visibly recognizable, and that can have a certainty rate that is like actually meaningful, and those are rules that are incredibly problematic, are rooted deeply in white supremacy, and are very much anti-queer and trans as well in how they're often used and why they're being used. But when you start thinking about play, you start noticing also that there are actually a lot of trans folks who are, very much disavowing these tools, but also there are many who are kind of wanting them for their own use as a opportunity to play with something, to play with the idea of like what gender might look like on them in a way that is like socially recognized. So I've seen people use automated gender recognition. Well, for one, is to do the like the face swap. Think about like what might I look like if I had these very stereotypical binary kind of attributes, and decided I wanted to pursue some type of transition in some way. And that can be really helpful for people. Or I see people who want to know, like, okay, is my hair, like, do I pass better in this way or that way? And like, there's a lot of negative talk around the politics of passing often in trans spaces for good reason, right? But there's also this way that like passing is also a way of trying to stay safe in certain contexts, and that can be a really valuable tool as well. So people often are playing with these things in ways that can be very expansive, or in ways that are more like keyed into that aspect of survival, and just trying to get through the day, which is also okay. So I've been thinking about play. Yeah, so I'm really fascinated by play in that way, and like how that lets us think about these technologies beyond this kind of good and bad, but like there's maybe different types of practices that we can start paying attention to and thinking about in relationship to our technology.
Yeah, I think that's a really beautiful way of putting it. We talked very briefly, not at the lengths we have talked about this, but about the Giggle app in my trans and queer game design class, just because, you know, you have the proliferation of an extremely transphobic tool, a social media app that has a, you know, a 3D selfie verification requirement. But clearly the developers did not anticipate that a bunch of trans women would pick this up and turn it into their own kind of plaything and mode of celebration. And I think the example of, particularly, I think of Snapchat's, you know, gender swap, uh, um, whatever they call them, filter that you can do. Like, is it incredibly problematic? Does it reinscribe very bivalent understandings of stereotypical gender? Absolutely. Has that single-handedly probably helped a lot of people figure out some stuff on their own journeys? Maybe also yes. And so how do we make space for the messiness of that? How do we contend with technologies that are reductive and troubling, but matter a lot to gender diverse communities? Yeah, I think
Exactly.
that's really such an interesting example. Um, so in my classes, we've been talking a bit about how marginalized game designers in particular have to navigate issues of both invisibility and hypervisibility as a result of their positionality. And I know this is something you kind of alluded to earlier, but you know, if you are a transgender game developer and you make a game that touches on anything, whether that's, you know, embodiment or sex or uh, heaven forbid feelings, then your game is a trans game. And having to navigate kind of the precarity and the frustration of that. Um, I'm really curious if you have any insights here about how queer technologists are navigating those dynamics based on your own research, whether that's with social media users or yeah, folks in any of your other work. This is something I think we're all kind of trying to wrap our heads around.
Yeah, so much. And it's one of those things that is not like there's no resolvable kind of answer to it either, which means usually it's a good question to explore, if sometimes frustrating. Because, yeah, being part of a marginalized group does make you hyper visible in some ways. Often you become an object of surveillance, and can be considered a threat, right? This is often specifically trans women. That is how trans women often become kind of hyper visible in this way, in these sort of ways. And then at the same time, like because infrastructures around like that, the structures of life really and politics aren't designed for you as a marginalized person, you can also become invisible and fall between these kind of like normative categories that are applied to everything, everywhere, and all sorts of ways. And those things are both harmful in different ways, and they affect everyone differently depending on where they end up sitting within these kind of structures. Yeah, the big thing I've really learned is that in terms of visibility and hypervisibility, it really does matter the context of the situation. So I find maybe not necessarily in terms of like navigating it yourself, but if you're wanting to study something like this, really tuning into like specific examples and thinking out from there is really helpful. Um, in terms of like also being, you know, scholars, game developers, or generally like marginalized people trying to do something that they like, and trying to like navigate that, I think that it's really critical to start thinking about, I guess, communities is how I want to think about that. And I don't mean that in this like very vague like the trans community, as this kind of as if that's one big thing. Yeah, I really mean it as in like who is it that you are in relation to, and how do those relationships become ways that you can support each other and build kind of networks of care. So again, those are always contextual and they're always local. And you know, I find like in my trans community, there are non-trans people, you know, but because there's ways that like they can be like, you know, I call them allies or whatever, but they become part of my care network, and they lift me up and help me kind of succeed in the ways that the perils of, you know, hypervisibility or invisibility really, yeah, they help address that. So for example, like one of the projects that I'm working on with Dr. Laura Horak at Carleton University is the Transgender Media Portal, which is this super cool project. It's like a IMDb page for trans filmmakers.
Yeah,
I'll share a link in a sec. But
I
it's
got you.
thank you. But this has been a big project, and like even though it's actually a very simple site, we built it like it's like 1999. Like it is built using like very so that way it doesn't die when
Right.
WordPress updates or whatever, right? So it's like that was a technical thing in itself of trying to how do we make this sustainable, but also the amount of thought we had to think or that we had to put into thinking of how do you actually make a database of trans people when a database is all about categories and trans people are all about like moving between those categories, right? And there's a lot, and there's always kind of these problematic aspects to it. And so it's people change. This is like kind of the thing, right? So like we have to be able to be agile and able to like change the categories assigned to people. Also, sometimes categories are like it means one thing to one person and something else to someone completely different. And so how do you want to be able to see these things together because that makes it meaningful if you're looking for example, trans feminine filmmakers, but maybe someone identifies as a trans woman, someone else is trans feminine. How do you keep these things together? So these are difficult questions but I bring it up because all of this work is about trying to navigate this problem of hypervisibility and invisibility. And the way that we have kind of decided to go is that there's a certain aspect of hypervisibility that happens when you have a whole database full of trans folks. But it's a way of because we're deciding to like let people describe themselves in their own words and use their own identity categories and like bring those things together. There's a way that there's like a collective sort of aspect that comes to that hypervisibility that is diverse and really pays attention to agency of all the individuals who are in this database. And ultimately, it's meant that like these trans filmmakers, many of whom like had a lot of difficulty getting work going or like finding a festival that would accept their work or find funding, it means that now there's like a way that can boost them up. So hypervisibility can pull them also out of invisibility. So it's never a perfect solution and there's always challenges, but finding people who are going to be in your corner and who understand the complexities of how you are like navigating the world based on who you are is key. And those can come in all sorts of different places and including in like scholarly projects like this one, I think. So
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic answer, and thinking about, yeah, what are the sort of networks of care that can support you as an artist and also as a person, and maybe even those things separately and together sometimes, is incredibly valuable. And thanks so much for sharing your work with the Transgender Media Portal. I think it's yeah, contending with a lot of different struggles. As somebody who has to advise a lot of other researchers in the project, well, how do I build a database that like meaningfully accounts for the variety of gender? I'm like, this is not this is something that is fundamentally like going to be very difficult computationally to do. I think is something that, yeah, as game designers and as academics, we have to contend with. I've probably mentioned this in class at least some point, but I was giving a conference presentation at the Society for Cinema and Media Studies. I think this might have been 2 years ago, maybe a year ago, where we had one of the key figures in our presentation, who's a speedrunner, changed her pronouns, I think, 6 times over the course of the week leading right up to the talk, which is like such a mood. Totally, that's great. But
totally.
it's also, it is one of those things where it's like, here we are updating the slides, at 1 a.m. the night before,
Yeah.
because you want to give space for that kind of flexibility, and that isn't always built into the tools and the systems and the frameworks that we use. So
Yeah, and
yeah,
it's always labor, like this tension between labor and care that's underneath that. And yeah, no easy answers
wow.
there.
I think that's a really, really good note. I will also, because I can, and because I guess it's technically my job, I will in the chat post a link to one of Hill Malatino's books called Trans Care that talks about a lot of these things in the context of community building and caring for one another without, stealing one another's spoon drawers, so to speak.
Yeah.
Beautiful. So, the last question that I wanted to ask is whether we could talk a little bit about methods. Some of my students, despite my best efforts, are nerds and are actually interested in research themselves. And given the you're coming out of kind of like media studies and communication. How do you approach your research projects, and what are some of the methods that you find yourself turning to?
Brilliant. Also, hello, nerds. Great to see you. As a nerd, I love methods. I'm also a total mess with methods. And if someone asks what my method is, I'm like, well, yeah, because also I find, for me at least, when I first started kind of learning about research, I found learning about methods confusing. It was very much like, okay, here are these like terms. I'm gonna have to memorize what they mean and like then pick from this list of terms when I'm deciding to do a project. Um, which I wouldn't really recommend, actually. It turns out that when you want to do research, your methods are how do you get to answer the question that you want to answer? And so methods are much less about finding the perfect method because every method will have a flaw in some way. You can't see everything all at once. That's that view from nowhere. We don't want to pretend we can do that. It's more like how do we want to, methods are about asking what are the limitations that I'm okay with here and what are the advantages of doing this in this way, that like what does that actually let me see or consider. And so I mean, part of my like messy methods is that like a lot of what I do, and I call kind of I call it lurking as method, which is probably closer to like a digital ethnography. But a lot of what I do is like spending time in this online spaces where I'm interested in how people are talking, what technologies they're using, how they're talking with those technologies, how they're using them, and I'm just kind of like I'm taking that in. One of the technical things about that is like you have to do a lot of like screenshots, find a way to like keep all your data together, which I tend to change systems every 6 months, which is not very useful actually. But so finding ways to keep record of that, and also thinking about the ethics of that too, right? Because often people are like not aware that you're doing research in these sort of spaces. So that's like something you kind of have to contend with, but it does let you have like that context of like how people are, how trans technologies are being used and being made and talked about. So that's like the advantages. Another disadvantage though of that is that lurking as method can really bleed into your everyday life. So those boundaries between work and personal life, which I think are important while also being somewhat impossible, those can get really messy quick when your research is also kind of what you're doing before bed or something, trying to relax. Sometimes you see something that's so good, you're like, oh, I gotta think about that some more.
Yeah.
So yeah, and it also is it's not comprehensive. It's particularly like all ethnographic methods. It's my own observation of these spaces. So if you want something that you can speak to how many people do certain practices, then you might want to think about something that's closer to like a digital humanities kind of method, like web scraping or something, which is also a great method, but sometimes can lose context in those spaces. So you're always trying to negotiate what is the question that I'm trying to answer, or what are the things that I'm really interested in learning more about here, and how do I go about actually learning those things. And yeah, those things can change. I often find myself pivoting. Like now I'm looking at a lot more historical stuff right now, and I'm kind of like, okay, how do I do this? And just Googling historical methods is not the way to do it. It's read papers, see what people are doing. Yeah, there's a practicality to it, I guess.
No, that's fantastic, and I think first of all, that's exactly right. Like you never want to be looking at the diner menu of methods and being like, today I think I'll do discourse analysis. Although there are people who are like, no, I have this method, and I will grab the same size wrench for every issue. But yeah, I really love this articulation of lurking as method. I think that is the most kind of modern and progressive understanding of what digital ethnography is that doesn't make us sound like, I don't know, weird, chronically online, like pseudo anthropologists. And I appreciate that a lot. Well, amazing. Thank you so much for your insights here, Kit. We're gonna pivot now and open things up to questions from those of you who are here in the live chat. Please feel free to post any questions that you have in either the chat directly here or in the speaker questions channel up above. If things start getting really active in the chat, we can use that channel as well. I also recognize it might like take a second to like gather thoughts and things. So, you know, no rush, no pressure. And we appreciate that so many of you were willing to join us here on a Wednesday morning.
I'm curious, are most people here like interested in doing research, or that's like some of the nerds were saying, or is it a lot more of development stuff? Like,
Yeah.
what are people into here?
So one of the cool things about, so pretty much everyone who is here live, although not everyone, is from my trans and queer game design class. And yes, so one of the cool things about this course is it is cross-listed between our media and tech studies program and a lot of folks coming out of our game development certificate and women and gender studies. And we also have a couple of students who are enrolled as computer science students. So we have this sort of wonderful hodgepodge of folks who are coming at this from a very sort of like academic critical theory background who are like, I have to make games now. And then we have people who have been making games forever who are like, oh gosh, I have to read trans theory. And so it's kind of wonderful in this vein. Yeah, a couple of students in the chat are confessing to being self-described nerds.
Love
Mentions
it.
would like their eventual thesis to be somehow related to media synthesis analysis and how that relates to certain aspects of queer and Marxist life, which, you know, is about as critical theory as
Yeah, great.
you can go. Yeah. Um, oh goodness.
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, this isn't a question, but I'm gonna frame it as a question.
Mhm.
Thoughts on, and I think this is something that, you know, as scholars of online culture, and you alluded to this earlier, intersections of racism and what we call TERF communities, or trans exclusionary radical feminist communities, which is a shorthand for anti-trans extremist groups, predominantly online, and how they interpret gender. Yeah, Kit, where and how do we encounter these overlaps? I'm laughing because I know we know the answer to this, but I think this could be a good thing to sort of articulate a little more clearly when we
Yeah,
have a moment here.
totally. Yeah, this is well, yeah, I mean, a lot of it comes down to these essentialist ideas as to like what somebody is, right? I mean, TERF is like trans inclusionary thing where it's like gender is this thing that you are born with, you know, static, binary, can be identified somehow. And those all those ideas really trace back to these very Genesis sort of concepts that were coming up in like the you know, I shouldn't put a date on this because I think it's like late 1700s, early 1800s, and we're tied to a lot of just like incredibly racist notions of like what a body, how bodies differ, and how particularly racialized bodies differ in some sort of essential ways from like white bodies. Which was total pseudoscience, but that became very much attached to the construction of like what the like essential gender is, or sex as like male and female. So this kind of the gender binary that we have it as today, as in the kind of turf framing, as being fully essentialist and unchangeable, is like very much tied into this idea of like actually whiteness as being this like particular form of I guess like a purity, I guess, of like this like sex gender alignment. But the way that manifests today in turf communities, I actually like probably couldn't speak to. You could probably speak to that much better, Phoebe, because
Yeah.
I haven't actually spent a lot of time focusing on communities, contemporary communities now.
Yeah. Um, No, that is something that unfortunately I can speak to, although I'd certainly rather not. No, I mean, I'm happy to talk about this at length another time. I will say just
Sure.
for sake of brevity that within what are described as gender critical extremist communities online, um, much of their identity, they see themselves as uh, victims of gender ideology, and that is framed in a very specific interpretation of femininity that is rooted in whiteness. It's this idea that women are inherently vulnerable, that transgender people are predators, but all of that is predicated on sort of centering a very heteronormative, a very white understanding of vulnerability and femininity that bleeds into one another in ways that are really, really gross and,
Yeah.
as Kit put it, rooted in biological essentialism and some really troubling understandings of how bodies tick. And if this is an area that you are interested in, I know we read part of a chapter in our class, but C. Riley Snorton has a wonderful book called Black on Both Sides, which I will link in the chat, that specifically links sort of the history of really gender binaries in North America back to chattel slavery, and who does and doesn't have access to masculinity and femininity and how those get constructed. Anyway, if you want some more history, there you are.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm looking now. Also, I just read a bit of Joel Peterson's recent book on a short history of transmisogyny, which also speaks a little bit more if anyone's interested in digging in more.
Yeah, that's a fantastic example. Thank you also for sharing that. We have a question here from have you noticed differences between online trans communities on different platforms? Blue Sky, Twitter, Tumblr, etc. I'm also curious about this.
Totally. Yeah, yeah. I mean, my research has never actually done a like these are how like a comparative analysis of different platforms, but like absolutely. For one, the actual, I mean, talking about the affordances of particular platform infrastructures, there are certain things that you can do on certain sites and certain things that you can't, like posting certain types of images or like videos. This honestly is changing fairly recently as everything kind of becomes the same platform everywhere. But back in, even like a couple of years ago, there very much were big differences in terms of like, yeah, what could be done, what kind of communities, like how you can interact with people on these different platforms. And so you see, like on Tumblr, for example, often things are like extremely anonymous. You get this like the hashtags that are like tags, I guess, that like let you kind of be part of particular communities and be in conversation. So you see a lot of really interesting kind of like folksonomies. I believe Avery Dave Griff has written a bit about this, that appear on trans Tumblr, where new languages, new categories are kind of being debated and explored using specifically like Tumblr's tagging function. Meanwhile, on Twitter, it's like more difficult to have those kind of like community discussions. Like you can use hashtags, but they often kind of like blow up into these like really big conversations, or you might not have a like relation to the other accounts who are like talking in those sort of spaces. And that happens on Tumblr too, but in slightly different ways, just because the way that like networks end up kind of like building within those spaces. Facebook groups you could think about, like that one, like Facebook is totally tied to your like real life existence, which often makes it quite difficult for people who are trying to explore their gender to do that on a platform like Facebook, because you kind of have to be weirdly public about it, or someone like your mom or whatever, or a friend at school might see. So it does totally shape the kind of conditions of what can happen.
Yeah, I think that question of privacy and access is really important. I've put a link to that article that Oliver and Avery Dame Griff both contributed to about Tumblr for those of you who are interested. I will also mention, and this was an optional reading in art class, so it's okay if you didn't get to it. But Avery Dame Griff's book, The Two Revolutions, is particularly great if you want to know a little bit about kind of just the history of queer internet, and queer folks and the internet. You're getting lots of readings this in this
Sorry.
session, so this is very exciting. And that actually, I think, transitions us really well to the next question we have here from, which is, I think, a really, really good one for researchers to think about. If you use social media as part of your research, how do you go about using it casually, if at all? I know I'd have a hard time reconciling all of the critical things I'd note about specific platforms. And before you answer this, Kit, I will just say I am currently writing a book on Discord specifically, and as someone who does a lot of Discord research and is here right now running this event on Discord, and also someone who is taught on Discord, it's not easy or
No.
necessarily fun, but yeah. Insights, Kit?
Yeah, I mean, that question's great. It gets right to the heart of kind of the problem in some ways of these objects that, or platforms that we're interested in studying. I mean, there's a couple of things. One is that they're always changing. So the speed at which this kind of object of focus changes often is totally way ahead of academic time, which I find very tricky. But using it casually, if at all, it's wish I had a good answer for you. A lot of it is like trusting that you're going to like notice interesting things, and also trusting that like sometimes it's okay to just take a screenshot and take a look at it later, and like kind of documenting that. And that's specifically like when you're thinking about what's happening on the platforms. I also, one way that I can kind of separate the platform use from like the other things that I find very critical to studying things happening on social media or on platforms is looking at the platforms themselves in terms of their policies, their community guidelines, their ownership. That tends to fall. I'm not reading community guidelines before bed, so that one is like much easier to be like, okay, today we're going to analyze this. So yeah, I guess remembering that like also the way that these things are built, not just on the user side, but like the kind of the political economy of them, I guess, are also important to take a look at too. So that can kind of help separate it. But I'm actually not. One of the reasons why my research is turning more historical right now is because I like have just not found myself wanting to be on social media at all, and I feel very exhausted by it. And I've separated that a little bit in my life, and it feels better. I feel like now that I'm more established where I'm at, I have a lot more of a community that's like in like local community here, which then becomes a problem methodologically, right? If I say I'm going to be studying platforms and I'm like, I don't really want to be on those platforms, that does kind of have to shift those projects. So I'm also struggling with that question right now, Gavin.
It is, and I will just say, I think, for like all of the Twitter scholars I know who having to face the implosion of Twitter, like, yeah, these things do really get tied up with each other. The only thing I will mention here is if you are ever doing research in communities that you really aren't a part of, or if you're ever dumb enough to study extremist communities in the first place. In those instances, it is very common to not only have like specific research accounts that are different from your personal accounts, but in some cases to have separate devices. This is the kind of thing where a lot of extremism researchers will purchase phones and SIM cards and things like specifically for research purposes, so that they can curate algorithmic feeds and understand how people get fed certain disinformation patterns and things. But that isn't something you would ever want to do on your own Facebook or Reddit or Twitter or whatever. That would be really dangerous.
Thank you. That's a really good point.
Yeah, we have a couple of other questions here, so I'm going to ask the ones I think that might be a little bit quicker, so we can hopefully get to as many as possible. We have a question here from, do you ever use machine learning as a tool in your own research, or is it more that you study kind of existing AI algorithms?
Good question. I do use it, and that is because It's so there's this concept of I guess like critical simulation is what it's called. That's from a paper by Jean Burgess. I'm sorry, throwing all the readings at you,
Love this. This is
but
great.
it's essentially what it is it's these researchers in the Queensland University of Technology. They have built an image classifier that works much like, for example, Instagram's like Explore page. So it like takes a look at what images are there and tries to figure out what is in common between them and kind of gives you categories and gives you like a tree of like how it sorted them. And so what that does is it means you're actually like simulating the technology of Instagram that you don't have access to the back end for, and that then you can kind of try to like deconstruct knowing the inside of that black box that you built. So it's kind of like you simulate the algorithm itself. So I do like to mess around with different machine learning models and just being like, okay, what is this doing? What happens when I do this? If I change it in this way, like, or use these types of data, train it, like, how does that change? So in that way, it can be really useful. It's also, yeah, in some ways, you're also like, for example, with the automated gender recognition stuff, it's like, I want to know what tools people are using. And as people are talking about that, I'm going to pull those up and I'm going to mess with them too, to like experience them myself. So that kind of gets also to that kind of situated kind of perspective that my research always has to have with themes. So
yeah. The other week we actually did pull up media artist Ada's The Misgendering Machine, and students did a bit of playing with that. And then, yes, we did not put the technical terms on it, but I think framing that as critical simulation is a really great kind of methodological intervention there. I'm hoping we have time for maybe one or two more questions. This last one, we have an upvoted question here from when designing the Transgender Media Portal, did you ever run into material that you were unsure whether it belonged in the archive or not? If you can speak on that, like, what was it? What made it hard to decide?
and yeah, one big one is the very expansive category of media itself. And so actually, yeah, okay. Actually, I'm going to back up before I say that one. The first one is the very expansive category of transgender itself, where it's like, okay, just did someone, if this is about a trans person, is it trans media? If this is a a film that's not directed by a trans person but has a trans actor in it, is it considered trans media? And these are like very big questions that then very much shape what the portal ends up like, what kind of data we end up putting in there. So we did have to just make some like executive decisions about what that means, and we actually like wrote about that process of making those decisions and put that into our policy because we wanted to be really transparent about it too. That was really important to us. So we decided that okay, we're only going to do trans-made things, but that does include sometimes when there is like an actor, for example. But we're not going to list that as a trans film. We'll list it as a non-trans film that then can still come up. So actually, the search page of the portal by default only shows you trans films. When you search something, you have to actively tick off that thing in order to get then the non-trans made media come out. But then the second part of that is what is media? And there are so many incredible trans media makers now who are doing like making specifically audiovisual media that like not even games, but like short form video, TikTok, like you get like there's YouTube web series, and we're kind of like, how do we get all of that in there? And so largely for the sake of just having a manageable amount of data that a small team can actually work through, we decided to focus on series. YouTube series can count because they're kind of like TV series, but otherwise it tends to, we stick towards like more film and TV that's produced in that kind of like large sort of scope. But there's so many other cool things that we're always like, oh, wouldn't it be so good if we could like highlight these artists here? But maybe we need a trans game portal of some sort, or yeah, I don't know.
I don't know either. I mean, yeah, that challenge of creating a database at all for things that are necessarily so murky and shifting. A Sisyphean task, arguably, but one it sounds like y'all have tried to approach with a good degree of transparency. And I will say that question of what is media, as newly minted media professor. Nobody knows. And
No.
Kit and I both know this. The Society for Cinema and Media Studies, every year there are screaming matches in those board meetings where they decide what panels are going to air, where somebody is like, board games aren't media, and somebody will break out their copy of board games as media, and we'll do this whole debate all over again. It's a,
I mean,
it's,
the way I looked at reproductive hormones was as media. I was like, hormones are media. Let's talk about it like that. So you can do really cool stuff that way. It lets you think about things very differently, but it's very, yeah, frustrating when you're trying to have a field that, wants to have boundaries around it.
Amazing. Hormones are media. That's metal. I love that. Um, I want to see who that gives a heart attack on the SCMS advisory. Um, we're talking
Mixture.
real inside baseball. Yeah, one of my students would like to get hormones or media tattooed. Yeah, me too. That's great. We'll all go. Class field trip.
Okay. Yeah.
Perfect. Well, there are some other great questions in the chat, and I'm sorry we didn't get to everything. But thank you all so much for having such wonderful questions. Thank you again to Kit for taking this time to chat with us. This has been wonderful. I am going to do the weird thing now where I'm going to sign off the recording and then sign us off in real time. Okay, so I'll start by saying thanks so much to all of you who are here live, to those of you who are watching the recording. I hope this was enlightening. We will catch you in the next one. And then, oh wait, actually, sorry, there's one last thing. Kit, we have been asking every guest we have this series to do their favorite sign-off to end the video. So as a social media connoisseur, and here's the fun thing, I haven't told anyone that we're going to do this. I give you all the questions in advance, but this one I'm going to put you on the spot. Do you have a favorite?
The fun thing, huh?
Yeah, like, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. We've had the later besties. It's truly whatever your favorite sign-off is.
My favorite sign off. Oh no. I think it's I don't know, I think right now it's really take care of yourself and the people around you, and thanks so much.